Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. My name is Elijah. I'm a blacksmith and bladesmith by trade. Today I'm going to bring you along on a batch of knives and show you how I forge some great little Sanmai kitchen blades. If you've ever been interested in making something like this or just want to know how they're made, you'll enjoy this video. I'm going to give you some detailed explanation on a lot of why and how I'm doing things. So let's get started. The knives I'm building today are going to be Sanmai construction, which means they are made of 3 separate pieces of steel. Sanmai literally means 3 pieces in Japanese. What we have here is our mild steel that we've cut up into pieces. We now need to cut up steel to fit in between these, and that has to be good blade steel that's going to hold an excellent edge. A properly done forge welded Sanmai blade is a really neat piece. It's got some really neat aesthetics to it. But that's only part of the reason I'm using this technique. There's other benefits to it as well. And one of those being that we get to combine 2 very different types of steel and therefore 2 very different types of characteristics into the same blade. So first off, we started with some mild steel, low carbon steel, what have you. It's got about 0.2% carbon in it, very tough, and readily available. It would not make a good edge steel, however, because there's no way to harden it and it won't hold an edge. But then we have our high carbon blade steel here, and this is 52100, so it has about 1% carbon in it and a little bit of chromium. Excellent properties for making a great blade. However, when you heat treat nearly any steel to the hardness that you need for good edge retention, you're going to lose a considerable amount of toughness for the overall blade. There are different ways to get around that and to bring toughness back into the picture of the overall package. However, this is one time-tested way in which we can do that by combining a very tough, softer steel with what's going to be harder, good edge retention blade steel. That way we have a great all-around blade. Secondly, or thirdly, depending on how you look at it, the high carbon steel that we use for the edge, the center of this blade, is considerably more expensive than this mild steel. And right away, if you're like me, you're thinking, okay, there's some cost savings there. So this does have roots in historical bladesmithing, where quality steel for a knife, for a blade, was far more difficult to get than anything we can imagine today. And so you could combine different steel and or iron in the same blade to not only make up a piece that was big enough to make the blades you wanted, but to contain that good material to just the edge. There's lots of different ways of doing this. Sanmai is just one. At this point I have all our blades forged to the thickness that I want, and the profile is going to be cleaned up a little bit more as we move forward. Right now they're in the forge. I brought them up to a dull orange or red heat. I'm going to let them cool down to almost a black heat, and then I can take them out. My goal is not an annealing process here, sort of an abbreviated softening or annealing process, not a full anneal is what I mean. And that's going to allow me to easily straighten the blade without stressing the steel too much, and make sure that we have a nice straight piece of steel going into the normalizing process. Here's our blades, and as you can see, the bevel is forged in for the most part. They're about 1/8 of an inch thick here at the spine with a distal taper down. So this is an appropriate thickness for this type of knife. The next thing I want to do is go ahead and develop the profile on each of these for the next step. Now that we have the profile defined on our first knife here, I can use it as a template for the other three. And you'll notice that I am staying away from the edge of our forged blade here. As I mentioned earlier, the propensity for the edges of the billet and the ends of the billet to not fully forge weld is very common. It's just kind of part of the deal. So that'll keep us away from that. And this profile is not even, I'm going to go a little bit smaller than this, narrower and such. I just want to make sure that I have enough material to remove following our heat treat process so that we're not dealing with any kind of decarb. This will give us a good uniform blade shape to work with. From this stage of the game onward, having a straight blade is very important. It's going to determine a lot of things, but going into the normalizing, that's what you want to normalize, is a straight piece of steel, so that you end up with a straight piece of steel in the end. And especially when speaking of sand mai, it's important that you are able to maintain the centeredness of your edge steel, and having a straight blade is also a big part of that as well. So there's not much else in the bladesmithing or knife making world that is more varied in opinion or ideas than metallurgy and heat treatment of steel, of your blade, no matter how you actually construct it. And what I'm doing here is the beginning of a fairly extensive heat treating process that is designed to bring out the best characteristics of the steel possible. This first step here is called normalizing, and normalizing is where you heat the steel to a specific temperature, usually between 1600 and 1650 degrees. And this is designed to create a uniform grain structure and to relieve the stress created through the forging process. During this process, once the blades cool down to a black heat, there's no incandescent color showing, we can go ahead and put them back in the kiln and repeat the process several more times at specific temperatures. This is a great opportunity to point out another characteristic of the sand mine blade construction that I really appreciate, and that is the ability to do these extensive heat treat processes with the protection of the mild steel cladding over the edge steel. So when you forge your blade thin, or if you grind it thin and then do extensive heat treating to it, you run the risk of decarburizing the steel where the actual edge is going to be. That's something you always have to be aware of, and this varies with the different types of steel that you might be using. Some decarburize much worse than others, but in the case of this sand mine construction, we have that mild steel on the outside of the blade taking the brunt of the deterioration caused by the atmospheric conditions at high heats. And so I find that to be a useful component of this process as well. And of course we can go ahead and grind back at the very edge, on edge, you know, the appropriate amount of steel to get to the good, untouched and unspoiled steel that we want for edge at the end of this process. Now, while the quenching or cooling of the blade has to happen in a matter of seconds, and that range varies depending on the steel, the chemical composition of the steel, that has to happen at a fast rate regardless. But the actual transformation of the steel takes somewhat longer, actually. Particularly if you do not quench the blade all the way down to ambient or coolant temperature. And that allows you to achieve the full hardness of the blade, of the steel, that you would otherwise, but at a slower rate. And in the meantime, you have the opportunity to straighten and manipulate the steel as needed, which is what I'm doing here. So none of these blades came out perfectly straight out of the quench. They were fairly straight, which is a testament to our normalizing procedure, but not completely. And that's quite common, but it's not a big deal if you use this method that I am here and carefully straighten your blade and keep an eye on it as the temperature comes down closer to room temperature and as the hardening process completes itself. The transformation of the steel completes itself. Alright, at this point we have all our blades fully heat treated, so that's normalized, hardened, tempered, and these are ready to finish into knives. Now, this is also a great opportunity to show you what can happen and talk about how to avoid it. So you'll notice that I've got some odd blade profiles here, and obviously not what I was originally going for. So what happened is that a couple of small delaminations where the forge weld didn't weld together, and you basically have what looks like a crack, but it's where the pieces of steel did not forge weld together fully. These blades are perfectly fine. These two had a couple of spots where we had issues, and I had to grind those out. And so you can see on this particular one here and this one here what I ended up with, which was not what I wanted, of course. So let's talk about that. How did that happen and how to avoid it? So when you forge out a piece of steel, it elongates, and what you're looking at in this spot right here and approximately this spot right here is actually what the corner of our billet was originally, where we placed that arc weld in the corners to hold our pieces of steel together. That spot, those corners actually end up back about a quarter of the way, depending on how thin you forge the stock, they end up back on the sides just because of the way the steel elongates during the forging process. And as we mentioned earlier, anytime that you use the arc welder to tack stuff together, you're creating a problem spot. Now we cut that off on the ends, remember, and we're good to go there. And I should have, immediately after forge welding, ground off the corners where the arc welds were, and that would have mitigated this problem, but I didn't. And you can see we're fine on these two, but not so good on these. I think we can still make these into useful, good looking knives, so they're not scrap yet. But that's just a word of wisdom, I guess, on how to avoid that. So let's go ahead and do some more grinding. Alright, at this stage of the game I have the blades finished ground. We've got the forged surfaces cleaned off with the aggressive wire wheel, and the last step to complete these blades that I'm going to do is put them in ferric chloride for an etching cycle or etching process. This is really not necessary to the function of the blade. However, the reason I do it is to reveal the sanmai construction, give a very distinctive look to these blades. It just really adds to the aesthetics, and I like it. So that's what we're doing last year. So you can see along the edge here, that dark line, that wavy line, that's our weld line, and the dark colored steel is our high carbon steel. And then of course the mild steel retains a lighter colored or silvery colored finish to it after the etch. It's also helpful to point out that using ferric chloride to check where your center edge steel is at during the finish grinding process can also be helpful to make sure that you have things even in relation to where your edge steel is. So I'm going to let these go ahead and soak for a while, get a nice bold line on there, and then we can go ahead and start putting handles on these. Now that we have our blades completed except for the final sharpening on the edge, we can start making some handles. And I got a order here of handle wood, a bunch of different types of handle wood. So so this is kind of fun to open this up and look at them all. I think I need to sharpen this knife. So we got a bunch of handle scales, but we also have a number of blocks as well, which of course is what we'll be using. So these are some scales. These are bloodwood. Really like those. Those are neat. So this wood came from Bell Forest Products. They're online. And I've got some Bacote. I really like Bacote. Yeah, it's nice. Of course, these are all handle scales, obviously. So those will be for full tang knives. Lace wood. Yeah, so I have a bunch of scales for full tang blades, which is not what we're working on currently, but it's all neat stuff. Yeah, Bell Forest Products. It's not a sponsorship or anything like that. It's just my favorite place to get handle wood, natural wood. So what do we have here? We've got some wenge. Is that how you say it? I don't know, but anyway, it's got some neat grain to it. Marble wood, that's cool. Leopard wood. Some more bloodwood. Bolivian rosewood. So I got some really cool different pieces, but what I'm going to do here is combine some of these with like a ebony or darker colored piece at the front near the blade. So this is what I've chosen. We got the wenge and ebony, leopard wood and cocobolo, marble wood and cocobolo, and bloodwood and cocobolo. So obviously these are too long. If I add this on here, that's much too long for a handle, so we need to kind of cut it back to right about here. Well, actually right about here, sorry. And that'll give us a little bit of, you know, a chunk on these, which we can then incorporate into other handles in the future. Okay, so these are the handle blanks that we have to make handles for our knives with, and looking pretty cool. So let's go ahead and start fitting tangs into these handles. So we're going to start with this real traditional looking Japanese petty style knife, and we'll put it in the leopard wood and cocobolo. So I've got a 5/32 inch thick aircraft. I don't know why it's aircraft, but they're long, so it'll go down far enough. And that's what we'll use to start boring out or cutting out the tang slot. Okay, we have the handle installed on this knife here, and the epoxy just needs to cure, and it will be ready to put some oil on the handle, put an edge on the blade, and ready for use. So I'm going to go ahead and install the handle on the other 3 blades in like manner, and I'll show you those when we've got them finished. So we have handles on all the knives, and this is the first one you saw, of course, and they all have a application of Danish Watco brand Danish oil to the handle, so that kind of brings the color out, or the grain out a little bit. It is the walnut, so it's the dark stain, which makes the handles a little bit darker. So you guys already saw that one, but there it is finished, minus the final edge, which we'll do here in a minute. Next we have the Bloodwood and Cocobolo, and again that turned out real neat. I really like the Bloodwood. It's pretty dense, nice tight grain, real sort of a deep burgundy color. So it's a real nice handle material. So there's that one. And then we have the Wenge and Ebony, and I think that turned out really nice too. Just a real dark, dark color, very nice looking. And then last but not least, we have the Marblewood and Cocobolo, and that turned out really cool too. Look at that. So these knives are all a little bit different, which is the fun part to me. That's one of the fun parts. They all started out similar due to a couple of issues. We had to make some adjustments primarily on these two, but they turned out great. And some people are going to prefer this size and profile to this, and vice versa. So we've got a little bit of a variety here, all very serviceable, great knives, comfortable in the hand. I'll stop talking. We'll go ahead and get these into the leather room and get them sharpened up. Currently, the edge on these knives is ground to a 0-degree bevel from the top of the grind here all the way down to the edge. There is no primary bevel on here currently, which means the edge is very, very thin right here, much too thin to work effectively. We're talking like a couple thousandths. So what we need to do is go ahead and, by hand is how I'm going to do it, go ahead and grind in the primary bevel that's going to be the actual cutting edge on these blades, and that is going to bring that angle to about 15 degrees. It's going to be much stronger than it is currently, and still very, very sharp. So I'm just going to use the coarse side of my stone here, put some WD-40 or some type of honing oil on there, whatever is fine, And I'm going to hold this blade at about 15 degrees, and we're going to start grinding this primary bevel in. So you can already see this bright line here, which is where our cutting edge is going to be. And as we continue on, there will be a what's known as a wire edge that will form along here. We'll actually have little bits of metal come off, little bits of steel coming off, because we're actually taking this angle. It's a very, very gradual angle, and we're going to grind it to a slightly less gradual angle, which means it has to be thicker. So we're coming back a little bit, and that little bit that's out of the very edge is going to come off while we form this new angle. At this point, you can see that while still quite rough, we have successfully created a new bevel, a new angle, and that is going to be the edge, of course. At this point, we just need to continue refining it and getting that up to a razor sharp edge, and the knife will be ready to go. Once I've worked the edge down to the finer grit on the stone that I was using a minute ago, go ahead and use my Arkansas stone, hone it down further, and then lastly I'll use my leather strop with the fine polishing compound to put a razor sharp edge on it. So let's see how sharp they are. Okay, I've got the one with the wenge and the ebony here, and we'll just do a quick shave test. And it's quick because, you know, there's not going to be any hair left to continue. So anyway, this will take care of kitchen food chores. Don't worry, I'll clean that off. You know, this will be perfect for like peppers and even small onions, you know, all kinds of different stuff. So good to go. Alright guys, well that about wraps it up for this video. I'm going to show you some close-up pictures of the knives here in just a second, but I appreciate you coming along. I'm pretty happy with the way they turned out. They're going to make some great little kitchen blades for some people, so I think it was a success. I like the different handle woods and the kind of the neat characteristics there as well. So as always, appreciate you guys watching, and we'll see you on the next video.